What's up, it's your girl Monica, and it's time for chapter 2 of How to Make $100,000 Farming 25 Acres by Dr. Booker T. Whatley. And if you're new to the channel, we are walking each chapter of this book down because, as you will see over at Amazon, this book is extremely expensive. Like 2 weeks ago when I did chapter 1, it was $500. Now it's $695.63. I think I'll keep doing this every week just to see how the price keeps going up. I bought this one several years ago for $30. So if you can get your hands on one, it's a worthy investment. Okay. Also 2 weeks ago, I told you guys about Deed Dynasty, and I don't know what I was thinking. It was December the 22nd for that first video, chapter 1. And that's where I introduced the opportunity for you guys to come and join Deed Dynasty. What I was thinking, I don't know. It was 3 days before Christmas. I was excited, and I thought everybody would be able to join by the end of the month. That wasn't realistic, so I've extended the deadline through the end of January. So if you want more information about that, definitely click below. So now let's talk about the learning objectives for this lesson. It's going to be all about learning what the definition of cash flow is, how to create a cash flow plan, to pick your own business model best practices, especially as it relates to crowd control, animals and heat, parking, liability with people coming on and off your farm, cash control, how to handle the money, bathrooms, which you definitely got to have. So we'll talk about that ad nauseum. Now, before we go to chapter 2, I want to take a quick look back at chapter 1, because at the end of each of these chapters, after the main part of the content is covered, they do like a little question session, and then they have some articles that I didn't cover in the chapter 1. So I want to kind of go back and look at those really quick and talk about Gambler's Ruin and the history of agriculture. So let's take a look back at chapter 1. So there was an article, like I said, at the end of chapter 1. It was reprinted with special permission of Technology Review, and it talks about Gambler's Ruin. And this is David Ehrenfeld, and he was the writer, he was the author of this particular article. So a quick history, back in 1970s, the oil prices increased, farm machinery and chemicals became more expensive, and interest rates increased. By the end of the 70s, farms began to fail because the interest rates were so high and the oil prices were so high, everything was more expensive to operate the farm. All the machinery needed, the equipment, the gas, and all of the things were expensive. And a lot of farmers had loans that were heavily leveraged. And the interest on those loans was a major farm expense. So even though all these big farms had all this machinery and production and yield was up, right, they still weren't making any money, okay? Because the loan interest was a significant expense. And so if you haven't watched chapter 1, go back and watch that, because that's where we kind of laid the groundwork as to why all these farms were going big. The bottom line, it was not a sustainable situation, right? So Gambler's Ruin is a probability theory, and it's 100+ years old. And basically it says that in a fair game of chance with a 50-50 set of odds, the house is going to beat the gambler. Okay. That's just the way it goes, right? And in the game of farming, the players are, the house is the bank and the gambler is the farmer. So if you are a farmer and you keep going to the bank, okay, the house is going to win. The bank is going to win every single time, which it just confirms for me, if you can do it, don't go into a whole bunch of debt starting your farm. If that's something that you can avoid, please do. Like, all signs are saying don't do that, right? Especially if you're a small farmer. So David Ehrenfeld, which he's a professor, he says that there's 2 ways for you to avoid Gambler's Ruin. 1, you can either leave the game and don't be a farmer at all. 2, you can diversify, which also confirms and kind of cosigns what we learned in chapter 1 about Dr. Whatley's 10 commandments. You guys remember those? That you need to have 10 different cash crops, right? A lot of the farms, as we know today, they only do 1 or 2 crops. That's not diverse, right? If one of those crops fails, then that's half of their, profitability. So you want to make sure you diversify your farm, and that's very, very important. Okay, So when it comes to agriculture as a whole, agriculture was basically done the same way for about 9,900 years. Okay. So for about 10,000 years, there were certain internal, it was like an internal self-sustained system that didn't require any external outputs. So what happened though was those internal self-sustained inputs were the animals, the people, the sun, the land, the water, and the air. For 9,900 years, that was it. But what happened was the population started to grow. And these internal inputs were not enough to keep up with the demand of the growing world population. There were more people than there was food. So these internal inputs that were fine for 9,900 years are going to change here in just a second. And we all know what this stuff is, right? The external inputs about 100 years ago came into play. This is back, like I said, from chapter 1, where Dr. Watley was mad about, the farm services people and the USDA people trying to force everybody to go big and kind of looking down on the small farmer, thinking they weren't necessarily intelligent. They needed to go get a job, right? He said, no, there's a way to be a small farmer, right? And this was why this book was written. There's a way to be profitable and to be a small farmer. But he said in chapter 1, you have to be good at planning and management. Well, conventional farming does this, right? They get fertilizers. These are the external inputs that weren't used for the first 9,900 years of agriculture, right? So 100 plus years ago, you start seeing fertilizers and pesticides and fossil fuels be utilized in modern agriculture. And there is a whole nother video that I can do on the results of that. I think you know where I would be going with that, right? So let's talk about kind of why all of that happened. Why did all of those external inputs come in? Like I said, the population, right? There were people that were like, look, if y'all don't start farming in a different way, people are going to starve or start eating each other. One of those people was Jethro Tull. This is him, not the band, okay? He was the inventor of row cropping and thorough tillage, and he warned that if people didn't start doing like what he was doing, that, people were going to start to starve to death. Like, that was a serious concern of his. And I think he went to Oxford University and to study law. He passed the bar, but he never practiced law. Instead, he traveled around Europe observing different agricultural practices and inventing things like the seed drill, right? So that's when everything kind of started. They were like, look, we've got to do something. The population is growing. The way we've been doing agriculture for the last 9,900 years is not going to be enough to sustain us. So this is Justus von Liebig, a famed chemist who formulated the law of the minimum. And what this means is crop yield is limited by the level of the major nutrients present in the smallest amount. So basically, your yield, what you can produce, is going to be limited by those major nutrients that are available and present in the smallest amount. So that's the law of the minimum. So he basically said, if we can give it more, if we can put input, right, then we can get more output. So he is founded with initiating the creation of the modern fertilizer industry. So the way that things work today are in large part because of this formulation, this law of minimum that chemist Justus von Liebig came up with. Okay, now it's time for chapter 2. So at the beginning of chapter 2 is really cool because it starts off with a farmer named Judy Yeager, and she's kind of talking, she's telling a story, and she says, she's got a very simple approach to things. But anyway, let me tell you about her. Her and her husband John near Lawton, Michigan, farmed 90 acres, 15 of those acres vegetables, and then 40 acres of pasture, and they raised 50 ewes. So at the beginning of chapter 2, she has this really simplistic approach to her farm economics. She says, step 1, we figure out what we sold. Step 2, we figure out how much all that costs for us to be able to sell that stuff. And then step 3, whatever's left over, we would determine if we had enough to live off of or not, right? And so that was her thing. It was very simple. She didn't think, anything of it. That's just the way it worked. If they had enough, that means great. We don't have to go get a job off of the farm. If they didn't have enough, that meant that maybe they did have to go get a job off the farm. If they had more than enough, they would go on vacation. But it was a very simplistic approach. Whatever we sold, minus whatever it cost for us to sell that stuff, left over was what we had, right? That was it. But she talks about in this story going to a coffee shop to where all these farmers were to kind of overhear and learn a little bit about what was going on about this cash flow term she kept hearing about. And she said she was sitting there and she heard farmer number 1 at the table beside her say, my farm, she stressed the word more than one, right? That's plural. My farms grossed $350,000 last year, but I still have 20,000 bushels of corn in storage. I just hope I can borrow my operating capital at a reasonable interest rate this year, or I'm going to have a real cash flow problem. So the whole reason she went to this coffee shop was because she kept hearing about this cash flow situation. So she's trying to, kind of figure it out, what everybody's talking about, all the farmers. And so she's sitting at the table right by these other farmers, and they're talking all about it. And then the second farmer said, well, I did pretty good this year too. I sold over $200,000 worth of grain, but my tractor broke and I don't have the money to fix it in time for planting. So here she's really illustrating the importance of why you don't want to go and be, borrowing money from USDA if you don't need to, or anybody else for that matter, right? Because that's the way it's being done now, and it's just not working. You just need to, if you're at the beginning stages of starting your farm, you need to figure out what you can do with what you currently have and start from there. Because if you make $350,000, but now you're trying to figure out how you can borrow some operating capital, remember Judy's method? We start with what we sold, we subtract how much it cost, and that money left over is the only money we have to deal with. We're not going to go out and borrow. We're going to use this to figure out what we need to do next, right? Second farmer has sold over $200,000 worth of grain, but didn't have money to get his tractor fixed. Why? Because he didn't set money aside from his sales in order to be able to do that. So again, she's kind of poking fun at the conventional way of thinking when it came to farming. And so she goes on to talk about how the first farmer saw her sitting next to them and nodded, asking how they did, right? Her and her husband. And she said, pretty good. And the second farmer asked her, well, where did you get your operating capital from? And she said with an embarrassed tone, we set money aside in the fall to cover our spring costs, right? Remember? Very simple. Farmer 2 said, oh, so you don't have a cash flow problem? And so she says in the article that they all turned their backs and started talking amongst themselves like, you're not a part of the club. Like, you ain't got a cash flow problem. We're going to, go back to what we were doing. And so she said as she got up to leave, she overheard the youngest and most successful farmer in the group. Apparently he had over $500,000 in debt. Say that he was going to go get some hogs. And his accountant said he'll probably end up with a net loss, but they'll improve his cash flow. Meaning, you're going to go get these hogs, which means that you're going to be able to borrow more money in order to be able to facilitate the operation. So just be very, very wary of that as a new farmer. Okay, so let's talk about the cash flow chart. I have created the cash flow, I've replicated the cash flow chart that's in chapter 2. So let's go over and take a look at it. Now, what you want to do, this is your cash flow plan, right? What you want to do, this needs to be based on the crops that you plan on growing. So up here at the top, you want crop, and I just have them numbered because just to illustrate again, like in chapter 1, you want to diversify your farm. I don't care what you're doing. You need to do multiples of it. You don't need to just put all your eggs in one basket. In my case, you guys know I've got rabbit poop. I'm planning on doing cut flowers. I'll be doing some fish tanks with tilapia. I'll go back to the oyster mushrooms. I was doing those in buckets at the very beginning when I started my farm. I have applied for a grant to get some raspberry and blueberries going in my back high tunnel. I'm going to expand my eggs. Right now it's just for us, but I'm going to get some more hens so that I can add eggs to the mix. I've got some collards in the ground right now. I do plan on getting goats primarily for land management, but I do plan on using the milk to do goat milk soap and candles. So I got more than 10 crops, and I could think of more, but right now this is what I know that I really want to focus on, right? So you list all your crops, and then across the top you put 1 month for every you put every month of the year across the top, right? So your whole purpose in doing this cash flow plan is to be able to see when you have money coming in and when you don't. That's so very important, okay? So instead of going to borrow money, right? If you sit down and plan, like Dr. Watley said, he said a small farmer, if you get off the tractor and go into your office and sit down and plan what your farm needs to look like, then you can be profitable. If you refuse to plan, it's not going to work, right? So when I was doing this was really eye-opening for me, because I was like, okay, rabbit poop, I can sell basically all year long, but then history has told me otherwise. I can sell it all year long. However, people don't really want it until the spring. So I had to be realistic, right? So I said, okay, March, April, May, June, all the way probably through October is when that product would sell. Cut flowers, I had to think, okay, well, I would be putting stuff in ground, transplanting stuff into the ground after our last frost. And in zone 7B, where I am here in Middle Tennessee, that's typically the last week of April. I don't really fool around with anything until May 1st. Like the first week of May around here is now when because we've had a frost as late as April the 29th, 30th, right? So that being the case, June 15th-ish is about the earliest that I would have blooms. So June through, and I do have a second high tunnel coming, so June through November is about what I could expect when it comes to my cut flowers, my bouquets. So tilapia, I had to look at that. Depending on the species that I get, it could take 5 months, or it could take a couple of years for them to get to maturity. Maturity being a 1 or 2 pound fish. So I just said, okay, I'm going to give myself, a 5-month headway. If I got them going next year, in January, it would take, several months. I would be doing those throughout but once you start, they're good to go. So June through the end of the year. So you see how this works? You list your crops, and then you figure out when you would actually be able to sell them. You have to consider gestation period in the case of animal husbandry, and you have to consider grow time in the case of all of the other things, right? So you can't rush anything. It's going to take however long it's going to take to grow, and then sometimes it doesn't even grow when you think. Some things like raspberries and blueberries, as you see here, I have nothing because some of those won't fruit for 2 years after I plant them, right? So you have to know what your crop is, and then sitting down and doing this cash flow plan is very, very eye-opening. It was for me. Eggs, same thing. I've got 7 hens now. I'm probably going to go up to about maybe 50, 55 hens in the spring. And, they're going to take 16 weeks, I think, before they start laying. But once they start laying, they'll lay pretty consistently. We're in January, and I'm still getting a couple eggs a day, right? But as far as market-wise, selling to my clientele membership club, the one that Dr. Watley talked about in chapter 1, I'm going to just say, April through October on that. Collard greens, you can grow really all year long. Goats, same thing. I had to consider, their gestation period's 150 days. And I plan on selling live goats. Like I said, primarily my goat herd will be for land management. But we do have a large Nigerian population, Hispanic population. Everybody eats goats, really. But particularly the lady that does my braids is Nigerian, and she says, you need to raise goats. She said, you absolutely need to raise goats because we will come get them, the live ones, and we'll do all of the everything else on our own. I'm like, okay, cool. And from that, I'm going to do goat milk soap and candles, which I can produce all year long. So this is an example of what a cash flow plan looks like. Just sit down, take the time, and it forces you to say, okay, when am I light? When do I not have a lot of money coming in? And as you can see here, it's January and February, right? But you see what diversification does in the spring? You're not depending on just one source of revenue. And then as the summer months go on, now you really got it coming in. But again, like Judy said, you have to set that money aside so that you can prepare for the expenses for the next season. right? All right, so let's get back to it. Now, let's talk about the pick your own cons. In chapter 1, Dr. Watley in this 10 Commandments talked about the small farmer does not need to be going to the farmer's market, packing up stuff on the back of a pickup truck and sitting on the side of the road. No, that is not the way you need to do it. You need to bring people to you, and you need to know who those people are specifically, and we're going to talk about that in detail in chapter 3. But right now, what I want to focus on is what they talked about as far as the cons of the pick your own operation. Number 1 is parking. There's a story at the end of chapter 2, a fictional story that talks about a guy named Womp who had a strawberry field, and he put an ad in the paper and said, "Hey, come pick strawberries." And he was in this fictional courtroom because he disturbed the peace to the point where people responded to the ad so well, they were lined up in front of his house, and it was like a little highway. It was blocking his neighbors, and there was blocking traffic. It was just horrible. And so he got sued, right? Fictionally. But the lesson was when you have a pick your own operation, you have to have adequate parking for those people who are going to be coming onto your farm. And you have to consider about the fact that these cars, you need to, have some place where they can park where it's not obviously going to be damaging your crop, right? So that's something to think about. The second thing is in this fictional story about Womp was that one of the people that came to pick strawberries brought their dog and she was in heat. And somebody else brought a dog, and then there was another dog, and before you know it, there was a dog fight because everybody was trying to get at this dog that was in heat, okay? So in chapter 1, Dr. Watley talks about just don't let people bring animals to your farm anyway. I went to a training in Cookville, and there was a lady there that did Kiko goats, and she doesn't let anybody like walk without bleaching their feet or bleaching their shoes and, walking around on their farm, much less bringing other animals on her farm, because there's all kinds of bad things that can happen, illnesses and things that can be transferred or whatever. So, don't bring dogs. Don't allow dogs to come to your farm. Let people keep their dogs in their car. Money handling. This fictional story about Womp with these acres and acres of strawberries, and the money issue was that how are we going to know who's paying and who's not, right? And so one of the recommendations was walkie-talkies. There was also a situation where there was a pole that had like a metal box. So all of the money, once it got to be too much, they were basically dumping it into these metal boxes, and only the farm manager had a key. Now that was obviously in the 80s. Now we're, more modern than that. So if you're going to do a pick your own business model like I will, you'll have a point of sale that's probably an iPad or your phone and QR codes, right? For people to be able to scan and buy, right? So you have to consider that though when it comes to setting up your operation. Then the biggest con is the weather. The biggest threat to a pick your own operation is the weather. You can't control the weather. No one can control the weather. And if the weather is not good, people are not going to come out to your farm unless, of course, you've got shelter, right? That they're not going to come out, right? And even then, they may not come out. Bathrooms. In this fictional story at the end of chapter 2, he was talking about how his wife, who was pregnant at the time, was not happy with him because there was all these people. There was a line out of their house to use the bathroom, and he had to go tell the boys and the men to go behind the chicken coop and pee, and he told the ladies to go in the barn and pee, and one of the ladies took offense to that, and in this fictional story the little boy ended up peeing on his rug, and his fictional wife didn't like that. He did this fictional story at the end of the chapter 2 just to kind of give you the idea that these are the things you need to think about. You need to have some place for people to go to the bathroom, okay, in a pick your own operation. And you need to have some semblance of crowd control, where people can go, where people can't go, right? And then also when it comes to harvesting certain crops, some people, unless you have somebody kind of guiding them on how to do it, especially like with corn, they could damage the crop. So you have to consider crowd control from that point of view, as well as, ingress and egress on the farm. Now, let's talk about some of the pros of the pick your own. You're not going to be selling stuff off the back of your truck, okay? You're not going to have as much labor costs anymore, right? Because everybody's coming to do the labor. The pick your own is the people coming to your farm to be the laborers, right? And another thing they said that was that was a pro that I didn't have space to put here is that everything gets going on the farm. They talked about a real life example of a strawberry farm, I think in Illinois, where people were picking, was it strawberries or something else? Anyway, whatever it was, people were picking everything, even the stuff that, probably wouldn't sell in a regular retail environment just because of the energy of the pick your own. I know there's none left and I'm going to buy these. He said, I could have sold the rocks out of the ground. They were just buying everything. There was no waste, right? So that was another important pro to the pick your own operation. You don't have a whole bunch of packaging that you have to deal with if you're going to sell retail. You have more control over prices. There are no commissions or fees. Even at the farmer's market, you have to pay for a booth. You don't have to do that in a pick your own operation, which basically all boils down to more money in your pocket. So even though pick your own does have its cons, to me, the pros are way more than the cons. And so I'm totally all about the pick your own operation. So that was basically chapter 2 in a nutshell. And Deed Dynasty, like I say, I have extended that through the end of January for the founding members. Founding members, you're going to help me kind of formulate what this is going to be. Like Tuesday night when we meet every Tuesday night. This coming Tuesday will be our very first meeting. And I've got a MLS for you so that we can keep your properties organized. The whole goal is to get your name on a deed. Period, point blank. Like, if you don't have your name on a deed to property, or even if you already own property but you don't have a homestead yet and you're looking for land and you're ready to start making that transition, then right now you want to start looking at owner financing. And that's what the goal of Deed Dynasty is. I don't care if it's residential, commercial, multifamily, mobile home park, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what property class it is. You can use the method called owner financing to purchase it, right? Obviously, for homesteads, it's going to be that more rural property or maybe even a mobile home park. But whatever type of property it is, you can use owner financing in order to purchase it. Maybe you need to buy a facility for the stuff that you've already got coming off of your farm. Maybe you don't need more land. Maybe you need a building, right? So Deed Dynasty is the place that you want to be in order for that to happen. And I came up with it last month, just like after I realized that this is what brought me to the dance, real estate. I was actually in the situation of wanting to homestead. Credit was horrible. Almost got foreclosed on one day, July the 9th or July the 8th. The next day, I ended up buying the 5-acre farm that I'm on now. And, when I talk about it and I tell people how to do it on YouTube and on TikTok, I get such a huge amount of responses and engagement that I decided to start this Deed Dynasty thing. So just when I did this back in December, the 22nd, it had 139,000 views. I think that same video's up to like 142,000 views now, just in a couple of weeks. So that just shows you that, this is something that more and more of us are considering, especially given the fact that for the last 100 years, we've had these nitrogen, fossil fuels, and all this pesticide input. And look at our health. Look at all these cancers. Look at all this crap that's happening. I believe when I was reading chapter 2, I believe that the solution was that they forgot there was another option. Yes, the small farmer can diversify. Yes, conventional farms can do what they need to do. But if we as a society, as individuals, started to grow more food, every one of us, we all can't grow everything, but you can grow this, I can grow that, and we can trade off, right? Or you can grow this and you can grow that. But if everybody in the neighborhood is doing something, then the impact on our environment, on our health, and everything like that would be so, to me, positive. So I think that's where we are now. I think that more of us are wanting to get into homesteading in a sustainable way because we know that our food system is severely broken. So, but anyway, so yeah, I get lots of text messages. Not text messages, lots of comments, lots of emails. This is another video that's got a lot of views. So yeah, so that's what inspired me to start Deed Dynasty. And again, my bad. I told you guys about it for the first time on December the 22nd, expecting that everybody would know about it and hear about it and want to sign up by the end of the month, December. That was not the case. It was not realistic. And so I have extended the deadline to January the 31st. Somebody even emailed me. I'll make sure I email you back. But hopefully you see this video and know that the deadline is extended. I can't wait until Tuesday night 7 o'clock Central Standard Time will be our first meeting. And we do this every single Tuesday night. So if you're ready to start looking for property and buying property, definitely check out the Dynasty. And I will see you guys next time for Chapter 3 in How to Make 100,000 Farming 25 Acres, where we will be talking about setting your CSA up. Okay, I'll see you then. Peace.